the city's chief planner, Kairos Shen, will be reviewing some of the urban design context framework from which the municipal harbor plan will be developing from, provide some important guidance moving forward as we get into the more parcel-specific planning aspect of the effort moving forward. Do you need a pointer? Yeah, I got one.
Oh, no,
This is a very weird frame. I'm supposed to stand there talking to all of you who the center of gravity seems to be in this direction. So I'm going to creep over. Do you mind just clicking it for me?
Is that all right?
So anyway, thank you for allowing me to come this afternoon to speak to you. I think Rich and Chris thought that my role today would be to try to put some larger planning context around the work of the municipal harbor plans as it pertains to this particular area. And so I apologize if it's going to be very broad, but I think it's very important to actually understand the broad context. And then I'm going to delve down into some of the more specific, let's say, building context. So with the first, why don't we go to the first one? I was actually here for a presentation yesterday morning, and I started with the same slide. Since it's opening day in about, on the 4th, which is almost exactly a week away, I wanted to start with a comparison with New York City, because we're the world champions right now.
Yeah.
And you can see that, can you go back again? This is really part of the last 40 years of planning in the city of Boston is about cleaning the harbor. And can you go back a slide?
Yes.
It's stuck? Basically, this rectangle is almost exactly, because it is the exact same rectangle that is the 900 acres for Central Park. And those of you who know the New York City understand how important Central Park is to the civic and recreational life of the city. Now, there are many people here who have spent much of their career helping us clean up the harbor. That was one of the most important planning challenges and achievements of the last generation, or even continues to this generation. And those of us who are doing planning in the city now are inheriting this legacy of a much cleaner harbor that yet needs to be further cleaned. And not to point out other people, I mean, there are many people who are sitting in this room who are instrumental in that. But the point about municipal harbor planning and harbor planning in general in the city of Boston is try to reclaim the inner harbor to become the kind of civic and recreational resource like Central Park is to New York City. The inner harbor should be the same as for Boston. So that's a kind of, I mean, it's just so happened, by the way, it's not doctored, these are the exact same scale. Wow. Next.
There we go.
So another one, this is an aerial photograph of the city. Of course, the other most important planning endeavor that we've been working on has been the submersion of the I-93 corridor through the city. And if we can get to the next slide, it can become, you know what you need, oh, I forgot. We should have probably copied it onto the hard drive. So this shows the 27 acres of the reclaimed surface of the old highway. It is a linear park, and part of the challenge that we have been working on is to actually connect the inner core, the financial district, the traditional financial district, out across the greenway and connect it to the harbor. So to me, the 1-2 punch, if you want to think about last generations of planning, was the cleaning of the harbor and the submersion of the highway, because it really is, once you get the harbor clean, then you want to make it accessible. Maybe we should do that. Maybe it might be much easier to just copy it on our hard drive, because it's going to, the animation, well, not working. So this shows you the 1630 shoreline, the original Shoreline Peninsula, and the central artery and where the harbor is. Of course, the harbor, I think maybe we did have an inferiority complex because we filled in the harbor to gain the 900-acre inner harbor to compare ourselves to New York City. I don't know. But this is another important context, because much of the challenge, of course, in the planning area that you will be asked to make recommendations to us is essentially in filled tidelands. And of course, much of the greenway itself, as you can see, is also overfilled tidelands. Next. This is the kinds of connections that we want to see. You see the continuous harbor walk, which is essentially to provide the public access to that recreational resource, which is the inner harbor. And then the other bright green lines is a project that the city has been working on, which is the Crossroads project, which are these lateral connections across the greenway, connecting neighborhoods that had previously been disconnected from the water back to the water's edge and across the greenway. So essentially expanding the area of influence and the impact area of the greenway, as well as the impact area of the waterfront. So the notion is that the boundary between the water and the land is expanded. So the territory between the tips of the wharfs and the greenway and the buildings beyond essentially is so the planning challenge is to expand that so that more properties, more users benefit from being near the water and near the parks. Okay. Next. I wanted to show, because part of this is to try to understand the historic context of the transformation of the waterfront. These two images show aerial photographs that I will return to that are more contemporary later. But you can see in the turn of the century, and by the way, one of the most important projects that you know that this governor has been pursuing is the expansion of the South Station rails. And here, right around 1900, this is probably 1920s, you can see that the train station went all the way to Dorchester Avenue without the cut of the highway. And then this was in the probably late 1950s, when you begin to see the highway separating the financial district, the derelict and not some derelict buildings along the old wharfs. This is where the Rose Wharf, in fact, is today. And then new developments like the Harbor Tower under construction that were really ways to try to reclaim the waterfront. And of course, at that time, the BRA was working on its first harbor park planning, which was defining the opportunities along the water and how the city can actually begin to reach out beyond the highway. Next. Now, this is not exactly our planning area, is towards the lower part of this, but one of the things I wanted to show was the impact of such major intervention. So in a way, the boldness of which the planners approached building a city highway was it's the kind of thing that we can't do and don't dare to do anymore. Because I think the kinds of disruptions that a highway next brings to the city is quite dramatic. So this was soon after the completion of the highway. And what you see is that they literally, in certain cases, cut buildings into portions. We didn't take all of it, but that we cut and only took the property that was necessary for the highway construction. But next, over time, what started to happen, and you can see this from the previous image, was the large-scale parking garages. So this is Dock Square, Government Center Garage, and then later, of course, the Harbor Tower Garage. And then it goes on and on, down along the highway, which are these interceptors to take the cars that were coming into the city through the highway, through this convenient highway connection, and out, and we parked them, and then there was some walking going on, but obviously the kind of street life that actually the city had at that time was not really stellar. And then what happens over time next is that you see if this was a sort of cut, the properties along the edges starts to disaggregate further. And so the definition of that, the streets, the public spaces begin to erode. And then eventually, and this is actually just before the highway construction, during the construction itself, many of you again lived through it, and many of you were instrumental in making the Survive actually work throughout this significant construction period. Next. And then as you can see, the south and north surface arteries emerging and defining the areas of the park. You will recall that the 2000 plan called for 75% open space. And then certain parcels, like the Bullfinch Triangle, were defined as building parcels. The plan also called for civic institutions to be built over the ramps in order to generate sort of special nodes of activities to activate the greenway. And then you can see, I think this is the last one. I think one more. You can see the emergence and the reestablishment of the cross streets being more clear. And then, of course, those of you who, and many of you were part of the Greenway district planning process, helped us create a set of guidelines around the area defined by the highway itself for redevelopment, such as the government center garage, and then in the Broad Street area and so on. Next. So this is some of the historic sort of transformation. And you can see that, if anything, what this series of slides teaches us is that in the last 50 years, that we have suffered through a lot.
Yeah.
Right? And that in a way, the resiliency of the neighborhoods have been quite dramatic. That we now, I mean, I think many of you who work through the Central Artery know that I think we couldn't believe we couldn't imagine what really it was going to be like on the other side of this. But now that we're on the other side of it, we can't imagine what it was like before. And I think that the thing about it is that this area is actually quite unique in the sense that there is so many different physical characteristics. So, and some of it is defined by the historic period. So talking about the kind of traditional wharf structures, you may remember the earlier photographs that I showed, that the 470 Atlantic and maybe even the Goldston and Store building and the Coast Guard buildings are these, their form is more historic in the sense that they are fully built out to the lot line, to the property line, and they weren't very tall, but that they were very dense, and that was one of the sort of traditional wharf forms. And then you can see them as you go further to Chinatown and the leather districts and so on. And then, of course, there are the more modern crops of building, of which, probably, the Harbour Towers as well as the Federal Reserve Bank represent, which was this notion to go much narrower and thinner in its floor plate, but extend taller, and then create open spaces in the site itself, and to actually attempt to make them public. Of course, in the case of the Federal Reserve Building, over time, that those plazas have become much more defensive in nature, but nonetheless, they still contribute to sort of the breathing space between buildings. And in time, we also learned that without activation and programming, those spaces do not necessarily contribute in the way that I think architects envisioned them to when they were first conceived. Now then there were, and I think this is part of the historical context, where on the other side of the highway, which is now on the other side of the Greenway parks, are for a long time the tallest and densest buildings. And they were sort of a combination of some of a hybrid or a different form than the wharf buildings and the very, let's say, modern, sort of pure modernist structures. So you get buildings like One Financial, which actually tries to fill out the entire block, but is very, very tall and big footprint. In fact, it remains one of the largest building, actually, in terms of yielding square footage for the financial core. Then during the 80s and late 80s, there were 175 high, International Place, and other buildings that were under the 600-foot range, but there was a combination between not necessarily open plaza, but enclosed plazas and public spaces that were beginning to recognize the importance of public space in the building complex and within the site, and also the importance of connecting these public spaces to the street. Of course, it was hard for them, being next to the highway, to respond entirely positively, and so the more recent projects, and the Palm Restaurant, for instance, in the International Place, is a very good example of reclaiming what was the back of the building lobby space and making it active and contributing to the life of the Greenway. And then, of course, at the edges, of course, are these strange, I would call, specific use buildings, like South Station and the Postal Annex, which are really designed to serve a very specific function, but don't really perhaps contribute as much as the other buildings, nor do they even care how they contribute to the public realm. Now, next. I wanted to spend just a few slides to talk about the principles of the Greenway District Guideline, because the work of this planning committee is not constrained by the same set of guidelines that we had arrived at, because there's an additional overlay of thinking about how this area, this is more or less the planning guidelines, what is called the Wharf District. When we started this, you can see the middle part of the Greenway. The Greenway parcels themselves had zoning defined very early on. I think it's Article 47. And then we realized that as we had defined those uses so clearly, we did not actually spend time until 5 years ago to really look at the adjoining properties that define the parks. And of course, the Wharf District was one of them. Now, we spent a lot of time talking about the Wharf District and came up with some very specific guidelines. But I think that at that time, everybody recognized that this was an important step, which is to overlay now the perspective from looking from the water side in, as opposed to from the parks looking out. Next. And there, we talked about the four-legged stool, which is to analyze the impact of the development impacts of each of these parcels from four particular perspectives. And these are actually, we should get Matt and because he was one of the consultants that helped us produce this. So one is program and use. There's a recognition that it's very important that we have the right kinds of uses, especially at the ground level, to actually figure out how we activate the Greenway parks. The other one is, of course, the design itself, the building form. And then, of course, there's the issue of economics, which is how do you rationalize the redevelopment of these parcels, and how important it is, or how do we begin to think about the economics of feasibility. And then the fourth one is the environmental impact. Next. I think these are going to be, so obviously the work that Util did started to talk about how the cross streets as well as the fronting streets of the Greenway parks actually had to be part of the equation of thinking about activation and access. Next. We learned that the microclimate created by each of these buildings in the environment around it was very important. Rich and I just walked over from City Hall, and I think we were blown in multiple directions. And on a day like today, there is absolutely no way you could actually use the public spaces if the wind and condition wasn't favorable. Next. And then, of course, there's this notion about rationalizing the heights. Now, I already talked about how much variety there is in terms of the district, that you could find height references. But the question isn't so much whether you can find a reference to justify the height that you were suggesting, but to understand how that height begins to relate to all of the other things that we talked about. And in the municipal harbor planning process, the relationships within this and this might as well be the intersecting portion of a Venn diagram. That I think the state, because the state's issue about access and about protecting the public's right in this area that is close to the water, is all about ensuring its public accessibility and usability. And then finally, and this might be the most controversial part of our study, was that our argument was that it was not necessarily the right thing to look at. Next slide. To look at today's current feasibility, because one of the things that's happened with the Central Artery and the creation of the Greenway parks was that the state and the federal government have invested billions of dollars into this new open space and highway system, and that we needed to actually allow the value generated by that investment to have a chance to actually accrue before we figure out what is actually feasible. Because, and that's not a traditional and typical way of looking at the economics of the project. Now, I'm not going to dwell on that, except to try to remind folks that these same principles that we use for the Greenway study are the same as what we are asking you to help us with in this part of the municipal harbor planning process as it pertains to this area. In fact, it becomes more complex because, as I said, it's not just about the impacts on the parks, it's about the impact on the water side and on the watershed itself. Next. Now, this is, you remember the earlier map that shows the 1630 shoreline. This is actually, that is the more or less, if you go with the boundaries of the yellow, that is the yellow and orange shows different degrees of storm surge. So the red is of a lower storm surge, and the yellow is a greater storm surge. Now, if Sandy had hit us, I think the general consensus is that the surge would have been somewhere between the yellow and orange. I mean, the yellow and orange. But it also means that almost the entire planning area that you will be looking at is vulnerable to climate change. So one of the things, another element that we are asking you and our consultants to work on is how do we incorporate climate change and resiliency as part of the criteria of evaluating what offsets we are proposing in this planning area. So some of it, I think, rightly belongs in the public realm, and other parts of it is really just the building owner being smart, the redevelopment. And I think this is an area that we've been working in the city to try to become much more proactive. Many of you know that in the city we've adopted a protocol for climate change, which is that whenever a developer I've run out of time. So going on for too long is and many of you know that's one of my faults. So I'm going to try to finish. The point is that I think that the current Chapter 91 does not recognize explicitly climate change as one of the criteria. And I think that we have a chance to break new ground here, to think about how climate change and resiliency can be incorporated as one of the offsets, so that there may be an option to looking at different, let's say, building approaches on certain sites if there was a significant contribution to resiliency for this area. Next. I think I just want to leave you with this. This is the drawings that were done by UTIL. It begins to show in our planning area some of the description, the narrative I've given about the buildings. Now, I wanted to end by showing you the boundary of the planning area. Go next. So you can see this is the planning area in blue, the Chapter 91 line in red. I think Rich might have shown these slides before. And then I want to end with two particular examples that are outside of our planning areas that the state has approved in the past in the downtown. Next. The first one, of course, is the Intercontinental Hotel. Many of you know that this was a site that was owned by the state and was where the ventilation towers were. And that this is this trapezoid, three-dimensional trapezoid, is the conceptual line of the Chapter 91 building envelope. And we were able to convince through the planning and the municipal harbor planning process, and of course an extensive set of offsets, to actually be able to in fact build the Intercontinental Hotel. That's, I think, 362 feet at the back. Next. Okay, so I'm going to stop. This is telling me something. This is the for Russia Wharf, or now Atlantic Wharf, which is, this is the water side of the channel. And again, these are the historic wharf buildings. And then the ziggurat that goes back towards the Greenway. And you can see again, in this case, we were able to convince the state to allow for a 382-foot tower, but then not built out for the site, but with significant contributions to the public realm and access to the water, and in some cases, I think, significant contributions to water transportation. So the last image is just to, I think, unfortunately, I have to take my daughter to the doctors. I'm here, I want to take some questions. I hope this is a very truncated
presentation of some of the urban design and planning context that I think hopefully will be helpful to you as you begin the study in earnest. I think the next one is just to give you an image of the planning area, and in the context of what this is a very contemporary, very recent photograph. And I think that our belief is that there is a very viable municipal harbor plan here that actually would be very creative, in the sense that I think that we are looking for new ideas to introduce and to infuse this notion of offsets and benefits for municipal harbor plan. But we also realize that there are important sites that need to be renewed. Obviously, everybody talks about the harbor garage, but clearly the Marriott, Long Wharf Marriott, some of the other buildings that clearly could become parcels of redevelopment are things that we should also consider. And I think the goal, and I think Rich and Chris has said this over and over again, the goal is not to be so prescriptive that there is only one solution, but that it's prescriptive enough to identify the areas where we expect, let's say, creativity for the development community, and also opportunities for the advocacy community to come together and make some of these parcels redevelopable over the term that this municipal harbor plan is going to be adopted for. So that concludes my remarks. I'm happy to take questions.
Any questions from the advisory committee first?
That was really helpful, Kairos, to set that in context. The two examples you showed, one can clearly see the trade-off that was made between stepping a building back, allowing it to go up, and doing other offsets in water transportation. But neither of those projects achieve much in the way of opening up visual or pedestrian access in the way one of your diagrams showed we want to try to achieve. So is there an inherent conflict there?
I don't think there's an inherent conflict. I think in that particular case, those buildings both buildings are actually fairly narrow to the water. Even though in other words, the distance between the existing cross streets were actually not that far away. And in both cases, there in fact were interior pedestrian connections that were required as part of the permits. Now, some of this interior connection, while described, was not part of the official offset, right? And I think in both cases, there was sufficient room in the site to create, I think in both cases, there were at least 30% or 35% open space. Now, was there more?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I'm going to answer because I did comment.
It's hard to hear, but
before you were here. Hard to hear. You're talking about two sites.
It's just editing me. Oh, no.
I mean, you're talking about two sites that were restrained in different ways. Atlantic Wharf, which is where we are now, was because Mass Historic required them to keep the historic facade. Okay, so that created the footprint right then and there, which is why they had to go up. They could not, if you recall, the brick facade had to be kept. Everything else behind it was gutted, right? But the brick facade was kept because Mass Historic required it. So you already dictated the size of the footprint right then and there, which is why they had to go up. And which is why we have all these rooms and special rooms and the town hall downstairs and such. And that was not through the municipal harbor planning process. And then the other one, where some of you live at the Intercontinental, was owned by Intel, Extel. And again, that was dictated because of the vent stacks, right? So Elgus Manfredi worked around the vent stack. So you already had it dictated by a footprint that you had to work around, which is different than Hook Lobster or different than Harbor Garage, but not different than, say, Harbor Towers or Rose Wharf if we want to do anything there. And I think that's the problem in terms of the view corridors at both of those locations, although there's some view corridors.
Kairos doesn't need.
Thanks. When we first took up, well, it's not first because I wasn't around when we first took it up, but when we took up the downtown municipal harbor plan last time, there was a sort of a situation where we almost had to take a leap of faith on some stuff, and particularly on interior connections and interior open space. And you know that at Van Pier and other places, people go, I can't believe you're counting the network of roads as part of the open. And similarly, I think that when the only mental image that we had of interior open space was once the Foster's Rotunda at Rose Wharf, that there was, I think, maybe from the advocacy community as well, a lot of concern about whether or not it really made a difference in the same way that ground floor exterior open space did. I think that the success of these meetings here and the activity, both on the site and also inside here, is sort of testimony to the fact that we were moving in the right direction there. And though I personally can't imagine a view that's not improved by direct access to the water, I also think having a certain level of density is critical to the success of an area. So I want to commend you for this, and I know that that folks here would love to see as much of the presentation that you shared on the context on the web for folks, because I think that it really does help.
Frankly, Kairos, if I was to look back at your maps, I would say we need more open space. I mean, if you look at the maps that you showed in terms of open space, there's not much. And it's certainly the ratio of open space to building. If you were making that argument, I'm not making that argument, but I could see how some could make that argument. Because if you look back at the maps, and I think go back 3 slides or whatever, on open space, the density, it's very, very dense. And if we're talking about more residents moving into this neighborhood, and maybe we're not, then the shortage of open space in this area is pretty significant aside from the greenway, given the level of density and stuff. I happen not to be making that argument, but I know some in the audience will. And I think the other thing about, I think one of the things you pointed out is the evolution. In the beginning, the developers and such did not want the Harbor Walk, and the fights that had to be on because they said that people would come, right? Too many people would come, and that we shouldn't have a Harbor Walk, and the bums would sleep in the wherever. I mean, I think that's an issue. And I think then Bruce's point about Foster's Rotunda, I think having the mix of different types of uses, not same old, same old. We don't need more bars, we don't need more restaurants, we need more cafes here. There's no shortage of bars, no shortage of liquor licenses, no shortage of things like that in this area. And I think finding the mix that's more the CVS type retail, the grocery store, the observation decks, the art galleries and such, which frankly are missing in this area, would, I think, make it an even more robust area that would have more 24/7 type of activity. Because again, when you hear from the neighborhood, they're going to say no shortage of restaurants or bars or cafes.
Just to argue with your non-position, Vivian. And then we'll stop because we should turn it over to the people behind us. But I would argue it's not more open space that we need, but how we use open space better. We have the whole greenway, which is a lot of open space. We have a harbor walk covering that whole area, and what you stressed, which I think this whole area still needs badly, are better connections between those spaces, and not alleys between buildings. And I think alleys is probably putting a positive spin on what's actually there. But the connecting ways for people to see the waterfront and get to the waterfront and link the greenway and the harbor, to me, are much more important than the amount of open area. But we could argue that till the cows swim home.
Can I ask a question? I don't usually do that. I just pretend to ask questions. The mayor recently, sort of embraced, in principle, as an inquiry into sort of the possibility of doing something that my Boston University students have been begging for a decade, and that's to consider, to find ways to stop throwing the word 24/7 around and actually have some bars that close late, to have sufficient transportation infrastructure to make it possible for people to get home on the T. And I mean, if you don't mind, could you sort of react to that and and tell me that it was because of the consistent comment letters that my students did over the years that we decided to go that.
So there's a few things I forgot to sort of mention in terms of the mayor's policy that we have not, unfortunately, the mayor's been so busy. I have to say that my time with him has been very staccato. But there's a few key policies that this municipal harbor plan will have to take on. One is that the mayor has made it very clear that we need more residential. And so within this planning area, we believe that there is opportunity for more residential use. Now, how much is for our planning process to be determined? But in particular, he talks about, many of you read his 14 points of economic development. One of the most important things is about revitalizing downtown, not as a physical place, but revitalizing downtown in giving it a kind of more broader reach in terms of the people it serves. So in the sense of the notion of extending the use of our infrastructure, and I would say transportation infrastructure, let's say social infrastructure that you might include restaurants and bars into, and try to actually make better use of that to serve more people. Now that's easier said than actually implemented, because there are many challenges. We know that the planning agency will be charged at looking at what the implications of, let's say, extending the T is and having longer operation hours for facilities of, social facilities. And the question is for us as planners to convene a planning process that's not just going to be talking about the benefits, but also understand the potential impacts, and actually try to find a balance. Now, many of you know that actually restaurants are a conditional use in the business districts of most neighborhood zoning. And there's a reason why that is, because I think neighbors want to make sure that they have some input before the permits are granted. So we recognize this, but at the same time, there are, obviously the administration has asked us, well, explain to us better why this is, and is there another way to looking at this? The last thing I would say on the open space, I think what I was trying to do in looking at the few different examples is that you have buildings that solve their open space problem on their site, and then you have buildings that don't solve the open space problem on their site and leave it to adjacent areas. I guess my sense here is that your job is to figure out how we can figure out an equitable and not equitable is not the right word, a reasonable and a way of distributing the open space requirement to maximize the benefit for everybody. So it might include solving some of the open space on specific sites, but in other sites where we deem necessary, it could be solved in adjacent sites or improving adjacent areas. Now, the concept here is not to say, in other words, that we are looking for ideas from you guys in this planning process, and that while my gut feeling tells me is that we can't, the way the metrics of the municipal hub, the Chapter 91 is laid out today, is that it requires each site to solve its open space and solve all the environmental impacts and do all the offsets. I don't think that that's going to be workable, but I think that, to say that none of the responsibility lies in the site itself is also probably not workable. So I think that's, now we don't have a policy just to say that. Now, I think it's important for me to end with this. I have spoken to the mayor about this process. And I've explained to him that we had a very robust planning process with respect to the Greenway guidelines. And he says, that's great, but this is an opportunity for him and this administration to do its own due diligence with respect to the work that we have done up till now, and to use this harbor planning committee to actually offer a critique of that work, and also offer, if there are new solutions, to put it on the table. Now, I think our job in the BRA is to make sure that we communicate that effectively to him and his advisors, so that the goal is to arrive at a municipal harbor plan that would represent this particular committee and the work that we are going to do together, and then also the mayor has a chance to review and see, in the context of his larger policy objectives as it pertains to downtown and open space and others, that it's consistent with his larger policy that he could support going to the DEP. So I think, my coming here today is to kick that process off. And we will be spending the next few months going through, looking at different options. Our own consultants will offer, not only a way to walk through where we arrived at some of the 200-foot height limits on the Harbor Garage site, but look at other alternatives that weren't fully explored at the time when we were doing the Greenway studies. Now, I want to emphasize that the mayor told me to make sure everybody knows that he is neither retreating nor endorsing those conclusions, because he did not have the benefit of a public process that he is responsible for to advise him accordingly. So I think if everybody takes the spirit of that, what he instructed me to share with you, and embark on this planning process, I'm hopeful that we will have new ideas. We may conclude that the new ideas are not good, and that the old ideas might be better. But I think my job and my team's job is to make sure that we go through those diligently and meticulously. Okay?
Kairos, the mayor is neither retreating from nor endorsing what?
The conclusions of the previous Greenway guidelines as it pertains to the harbor planning area. So in other words, he understands that the current recommendation, the guidelines say that there's a 200-foot height limit and a 175 height limits on those sites that we previously identified as potential redevelopment sites. He understands that. He understands that's the guidelines. But he knows that we're convening a process that is looking at a broader set of constraints that now bring in the Municipal Harbor Plan, Chapter 91 kinds of criteria, which the Greenway study did not fully explore. And so he wants to see the results of that and understand our dialogue here in this room or in subsequent rooms before he actually takes a position on this.
Do you have a slightly broader charge then? Because it seems to me that repeatedly over the early phases of this process during the previous administration, that we were told that what we were doing is we were trying to bring Chapter 91 into alignment with the Greenway study. And now what you're saying is that one way that we can help you is to think a little bit broader than that as our job, which is to bring creative and innovative ideas and solutions that balance the things that you talked about with us. Is that a fair way?
I think I agree with what you said, the second part. I'm not sure that I would agree with the way you characterized the first part, but because I think the Chapter 91 or harbor planning process was always going to be more broad, because it included a whole area that we studied, but we didn't study in detail from, let's say, the state's perspective. Is that fair?
So, Kairos, the conversion to zoning is on hold?
No, the conversion to zoning was always going to be part of the harbor planning, the harbor planning process, right? And all I'm saying is that we haven't concluded the harbor planning process now. We're starting it. And what the mayor is saying to me is, look, if I've already decided that 200 feet was right, then why are we even doing this process, is what he's saying. I want to know why, and he's not saying that he's moving off of 200 feet, he's just saying, I want to see the BRA go through a planning process and rationalize the various alternatives that we're going to look at. Now, I just want to be clear that we also talked about, I talked to the mayor about the Intercontinental and Russian Wharf, or Atlantic Wharf, and just say, Mayor, just so that you understand the order of magnitude of offsets that have been approved by the state, these are the two closest examples. So I think that the notion, and of course, in the short time that we had with each other, I wasn't able to explain the intricacy, and Vivian will tell you that most of I just know enough to just sort of like fool my way or bluff my way through it. But I think that the mayor's smart enough to know that there's a lot of content behind what we are doing right now that he needs to review, and his staff and as he forms his policy around this. So I think that I just want to say that he's measured and he's interested in this process, and he wants input and he wants creative thinking, but he also wants to have a viable municipal harbor plan that the state can endorse, and that would also give a clear direction for the redevelopment that might occur in this area, so that we don't have to do very specific approvals or exceptions that are very particular to one site, but that we create a menu that the developers can look at and find guidance, and then the state can then matriculate with its individual licenses. And then we will adopt the zoning that's consistent with that municipal harbor plan offsets and guidelines that we come up with together. Okay. Is there no other questions? Oh.
It's not a question. One of the comments I thought I would make. I'm intrigued by, you started with a slide from Central Park and the size of Central Park.
Yes.
And you get to conversations about open space and access to open space. And I think it would be encouraging for the BRC to think broadly about how you define adjacency of open space and the resources that are available. Because if you look out farther into the outer harbor, you've got the largest open space in the entire harbor available to you in the harbor islands. Right. And access to those islands through Long Wharf and downtown. You know, if we can find ways to make those transportation connections, make it easier to get out there, make it affordable, we can really create a larger extension of open space that is connected to this neighborhood.
Yes.
With a wonderful resource. It's larger than Central Park, where you get out to all those islands and count what's out there. And the opportunity of defining adjacency to open space, connection to open space, and your ability to get out there, incorporating what you do when you think about what's happening in this neighborhood, to expand that definition, I think provides a lot of opportunity for creativity.
Yeah, thank you very much. I actually edited the slide that had the harbor islands, but you're absolutely right. And my daughter thinks that the beach, you know, is literally there. This last summer we were out, you know, almost every weekend when we were in town, and it's a tremendous resource. But the question about, so in our minds, the subsidies or the contributions that the development teams actually contribute to making that, shortening that distance, making it more accessible, making it more affordable, and all of that are real substantive. So we don't want to underestimate that. And I think that, you know, that the point about the harbor is that, in fact, you know, even though it's on water, it can have a tremendous positive impact on the recreational life of the city. And I feel like, you know, we have actually an open space that has more potential than Central Park, you might argue. But I don't want to get into an argument with the New Yorkers. We are still champions of the world.
I just want to make a quick comment. I think it would be helpful when you're looking at this to put on the FAR of each building along the municipal harbor plan area, because it's very distinct when you do that. They're about half the FARs of what's on the other side of the greenway. And also, for example, the Harbor Towers is always 400 feet high, and they say, well, that's very high. But the FAR is actually 7.4, whereas the proposal for the garage that has now been taken back was 18. So I think the FAR is a good measure of how you look at things on that area.
Yes, the mayor did ask me, by the way, one very specific question was, you know, so how tall can you go? And my first question is, well, it depends on how big the building footprint is. So I think one of the ideas is not to have a final measure, perhaps. I shouldn't say this. I would say that one way to look at it is the kind of the inverse relationship between height and the size of the building and the occupation of the site itself. And obviously, both have different impacts environmentally in terms of the shadow it casts. A taller and longer shadow moves more quickly, but it is, you know, it sweeps a larger band that's swept in the, let's say, the subtended area is larger, but the impact in each location is shorter and less. So I think that these are the kinds of things that we'll have to, I think you're right that the harbor towers are relatively narrow. It's not the kind of footprint that's idealized for today's developers. But we're also seeing in certain places in the city that we're getting smaller and smaller footprints because they feel the value gained at the taller floors and fewer apartments per floor is actually in the end going to trade for more value. That's why I think when we look at the economics of the deals, one has to be more open-minded. I would also say that I think I'm accurate in saying that the state's consideration, it does not include economic feasibility, because that's not the goal of Chapter 91. So we have to understand that that's something that I've been communicating with the administration and the advisors to let them know that feasibility, the way that the BRA might consider in its approval, is not part of the equation here for the municipal harbor plan.
Yes, sorry.
I want to comment on the issue of that the waterfront. I wanted to comment on the issue since it was raised about harbor islands and so on. I think it's fair to say that cities throughout the world that you really admire have a variety of opportunities, and therefore the waterfront is a situation where the harbor islands is a different kind of a place to go versus the downtown waterfront, where we only have one. It's relatively modest in terms of overall dimension, okay, that is from North Station to South Station, and if we're really focusing on the area that you're studying now, which is the Wharf District, which is really the heart of the downtown because of Faneuil Hall, because of the kind of things that you're doing in adjacent areas. So I hope when we focus on this piece of the waterfront, it isn't only a question of height, it isn't even a question always of massing, it's a question of creating the kind of environment that's rich in terms of all of those things, because the great waterfronts, and you've certainly seen many of them as I have, the ones that really work, that is, that people love and go to, whether you're a tourist or whether you live there, are the kind that have a variety of richness that appeals to the public at large. And I know that's a struggle, that's not easy to achieve, but I hope that's going to be the focus of what happens here.
Yeah, I agree with that statement, and that's, we're going to need everybody's help to help us envision these very complex and creative ways of enlivening and enriching our waterfront. No question about that. Other questions? So I think one of the other things is I'm going to be involved in this process from time to time. I hope to stay working with the city. I just want to be clear. I know that many of you may be asking, is this his last performance? I love the city, and I've told the mayor that I would very much like to continue in a role that will help the city continue to develop in the right way. And as this process, of course, Rich and Chris, Lauren, we're well staffed. We have a good set of consultants. But I'm going to be involved, I think, very closely. And at the appropriate time, I also, when the new director is appointed, of course, John Barris is now the head of economic development. We will have an opportunity to bring him to this committee to introduce him, and so that there are questions and issues that that pertain to planning and economic development. I'm sure he would like to hear.
Did you explain to him that you're irrelevant to the state?
Well, I did have that question, because that has been one of the questions of understanding the state's regulations. But I think that John has already said in public settings, and those of you who have been in meetings with him, he's committed to planning. He's also committed to trying to figure out how to make Boston attractive to companies that are not yet here, continue to make it attractive for companies that are here. So his agenda is broad, and this, like I said, I want to make sure that he's also engaged in this process. So I hope to see you. I'm continue to see you, and I hope this is a rich and combative process, because I think that if it isn't combative, then it's probably not. I'm a believer. Of course, I argue with my spouse every evening, and I believe that that's the strength of our relationship, because we have arguments and we're committed to arguing with each other. And so I wish you that a healthy debate in all of this, and that we come up with really creative solutions. So thank you very much for having me this afternoon. Okay?
Great. Thank you, Kairos.